This is Behind the Coffee, podcast by Grey Soul Coffee Roasters. I'm Chirag, your host and roast master. Sit back and enjoy.
I'm strolling along, just minding my business, humming a song. I'm happy by myself, not a care in the world.
So here we are, and we have a very important, very close friend of mine, a guest today by the name of Mrugesh. Hi Mrugesh, how are you?
Great.
Welcome to Behind the Coffee.
Yes.
Let's have some interesting conversation, and let's begin. So, Mrugesh, I think I know you from. I think during COVID is when we started Grey Soul Coffee Roasters, and I think you were one of the initial customers. We happened to speak over phone, I guess, and it was an interesting conversation. And back then, I knew that okay, yes, I'm talking to a serious brewer.
Okay.
So, actually, over the period of time, even I have learned a lot of things from you. So, a quick introduction, Mrugesh, for the audience who is not aware of who exactly you are. Please, yeah.
So I'm Mrugesh. I've been I think brewing specialty coffee specifically since 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So no, that's
Like I said, I've learned a lot from you over the period of years. Yeah.
yeah. It's been interesting actually, and I think most of my equipment I have at home, barring the recent V60s, I think, is actually imported because by the time I actually got that equipment, I didn't know of anybody who was selling in India. But I mean,
2015 is too early. Yeah.
so somehow I had the luck of stumbling upon these jargons and words, and I think back then we only had. If I remember correctly, even on YouTube, I only remember Whole Latte Love, their YouTube channel. And that's the first time I saw something about pour over. So I think they're a fairly old channel. And then you had Seattle Coffee Gear also, I think.
Mostly
Gale, I
about
think.
machines is what they talk. Yeah.
They had a very interesting episode about pour over, which I think they filmed in a cafe, I think, where they serve pour over is where they filmed that particular episode. So it wasn't one of their normal episodes. Similarly, I think, now I remember, actually, I think I started learning about coffee from this, I think Kappa Joe was the segment on Seattle Coffee Gear.
Okay.
And he used to have these segments about Chemex.
Okay.
That's where I learned a lot about pour over and filter coffee, and it fascinated me.
Yeah, I think from these channels, I think I have learned a lot about espresso machines and dialing in your espresso and which machines to buy and home segment machines. But good channels that you have named, because Seattle Coffee Gear is something that I've followed a lot for my espresso journey. Nonetheless, continue. Yeah.
Yeah, so somehow I stumbled upon the Aeropress. Had a friend bring it over for me when she was visiting, and the first ever machine that I actually got was I have been drinking so-called coffee my entire life, which is basically just Nescafe in milk.
Yeah.
And for some reason, my mother actually thought that drinking coffee is healthier for me because she did not want me to get addicted to chai. I don't know whether that makes any sense or
That's
not.
an interesting thing.
Exactly. But
Not a debate that we should venture into.
I have no.
I don't want to make any claims also.
I don't even know whether that actually works that way. So let it be. Anyway, the good thing that happened is I actually got really interested in coffee, and so now this is a bit of a. I haven't really seen people discuss this, but I think we have at some point. What happened is around 2012, 2013, I started looking at diets and food and health, and I had a lot of health issues. So I started looking at all of these things because the so-called traditional wisdom that I had grown up with was not helping me. So I started looking at those things. One of the most interesting things that actually happened during that period was I stopped sugar consumption altogether.
Okay.
So we're not talking keto. Back then, keto still wasn't around, right? So we're just talking cutting out sugar, like a refined sugar altogether. And that resulted in me switching from a cappuccino with sugar in it to cappuccino without sugar in it.
Okay.
And I'm suddenly like, this bitter flavor is actually interesting. I never actually noticed that.
Yeah.
So slowly, and we I think had one of those CCD machines in the office. The dark roasted beans, and you can't really have that without latte, right?
That surprisingly also made a perception for a lot of people that coffee bean is supposed to look like that. So, yeah.
So this should be around 2012, 2013, if I remember correctly. And then actually a colleague of mine in the office introduced me to black coffee. So this is one of those early, it's an Indian made like a normal coffee machine, which is like a percolator.
Okay.
Without paper filters.
Oh.
But then I tried some filter coffee in it and I was like, okay, fine. Filter coffee was too, I think, sharp for me because of the chicory flavor.
Yeah.
And then somebody suggested the specialty coffee. So a friend of mine got some for me, and then I brewed it through that machine. And I still have that machine with me, by the way. It still works perfectly fine. I bought it off Amazon for like $1,000 or something.
Something for us to try later.
Works perfectly even. Sorry, works perfectly even now. But anyway. So I tried coffee in it. I'm like, these are interesting flavors. I never knew these could exist. And this is still like none of those anaerobics and highly fermented coffees or anything. It might have been a wash or something. And even then I could say, okay, this is interesting. I can't really tell what this is, but I can tell that this is not just bitter. And so that's how that rabbit hole basically started, and that's how I got into it. First thing I got was the Aeropress, which opened a whole new dimension because I think around 2015 the championship recipes started cropping up. The Aeropress championship recipes. I think they started around 2015 or something. I'm not sure. That's when I started experimenting with coffee, and then, well, I'm here today with.
No, so whatever you said absolutely makes sense, because more or less I think for all of us the journey has been the same. Like you start with instant, then you move to cappuccino with sugar, then you move to cappuccino without sugar, and then you try to find that coffee also too sweet because of the sweetness of the milk, and then eventually you stumble upon a V60 or an Aeropress, and that is how I think a journey for an Indian brewer generally takes place. So yeah, I think we connected on that also, I guess, and I think a lot more people, our audience, will also connect on that, because that's more or less has been the journey for all of us. And I think since then we have been decoding a lot of recipes, decoding a lot of roasting techniques, I would say, like your involvement in how the coffee should be, which is a topic to be discussed later on. But okay, I am glad that we have been planning this for a long time also, so I'm glad that we're sitting face to face, we're doing this episode. Let's get started. I have a couple of questions listed for you, Mrugesh, as a professional, serious home brewer.
Amateur professional.
But I really respect, and I think I have picked up or learned a couple of recipes from you, and I've tried those, and it has made a difference in my brewing techniques also, or especially for my morning cup. So here you go. My first question to you, Mrugesh, a very simple question. What kind of coffee do you like? Like on a daily basis, or your morning coffee, what is your preferred cup of coffee?
Light roasted naturals. So here's the thing. I really like my coffee sweet, as in the natural coffee sweetness. Post-COVID, not sure if the COVID itself had something to do with, because slight divergence. But I had this very interesting experience during COVID. Is when I actually contracted COVID. I could only sense a very specific flavor in coffee, and that's how I knew. Oh, okay. So I think lost my sense of smell.
You are trying to say that you had COVID and then you lost
I
Like half or 60 or 70% of your senses.
yes, but then they came back.
That's weird because I also contracted it and I could not taste or smell anything for like 14, 15 days.
That's the weird
I'm
part.
not sure how do you have a positive spin. on
No,
the
but that's the weird part,
yeah.
right? This was supposed to be the normal experience,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Like when my expectation was, okay, I don't have any other symptoms, so fair enough. But one fine day, I suddenly realized, you know what? I think I can only taste one single flavor in every coffee that I'm making,
Huh. That happens.
and only a specific type of aroma was something that I could pick up. And I'm like, okay, I need to start paying more attention to whether I'm able to taste or smell things or not. And that's how I realized, okay, I need to get a COVID test done. By that time, we were anyway like more or less sequestered in the house.
Yeah.
So like everybody else, so social contact and those
So
things.
that led you to liking a
No,
light
but
roast?
that actually probably has led me to not enjoy heavily fermented coffees as much. Because I think back then I was drinking anaerobics, and this is also something we'll probably get into at some point, is my preference for coffee changes from season to season. So in summers I like different coffees, I like different kinds of flavors or textures in winter or monsoon for that matter, and so on. Back then I think I was carrying forward a lot of anaerobics from winter having just passed. And I think COVID, the first wave was somewhere around summer, if I'm not mistaken. March, April,
yeah.
right? So I think I was still brewing anaerobics at that point. And after COVID, I think anaerobic coffees exploded in general, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Like most coffees suddenly
Yeah,
afterwards
we
were anaerobics.
see a lot of fermented coffees in Indian specialty coffee, at least nowadays.
Exactly. So before that, I remember a lot of yellow honey, red honey, white honey being available, washed or say even
Clean naturals, no fermentation.
no fermentation. Exactly. So I think around that point is when I started noticing this very specific fermented flavor, and that probably happened because that was the only flavor I could pick up for the coffee when I had contracted COVID. And I think that has impacted my taste preferences afterwards, whereby I am very sensitive to picking up that heavily fermented flavor in the coffee. So naturally, I think preference has moved towards go to naturals, ideally honey. Honey processes I love. They bring out a lot of sweetness in the coffee. You don't really find that many washed anyway nowadays, but I prefer washed with Aeropress and so on. So that's a different. Yeah,
So there is no one cup that you like the most, but I think you would prefer a light roasted naturals
by default.
by default, but then you also like a washed coffee when it comes to Aeropress. And
Actually, probably Moka pot more than Aeropress.
actually, that makes more sense. Yeah. Okay, great. Understood. So Mrugesh, moving on to the other question. What is your preferred brewing method? I'm sure you just said Aeropress and Moka pot, but what is your preferred brewing method? Like, what is a method that at any given point of time, like even if it's your third or fourth cup of coffee, you would choose this method and have your coffee that way? Now that we know that you like a light roasted naturals, but what is your preferred method?
Light roasted naturals generally come out the best on a V60.
Okay.
So here's an interesting thing. I don't know. Have you actually used a Time or B75?
No, I haven't. One more thing to try.
I actually got one from Australia last year, I think. And this coincided with my 1Z Presso ZP6 special purchase.
Okay.
That has been my preferred combination for a while. I noticed like a couple of months ago I've shifted back to V60.
Okay.
So V60 and this actually slightly deviates from the basic question, but yeah. My preferred combination goes to my ZP6 special on a V60 because I'm drinking naturals most of the time, and that tends to bring out the sweetness and the acidity more actually. So
That also happens to be my choice of coffee and my choice of brewer.
And actually, if you remember, this is how we originally connected. I don't know if you remember actually, but I remember very precisely.
I'm pretty sure because you got I think, which one was that? The ceramic one that was chipped at the corner.
That was
April brewer is what you got also, and then we experimented a lot, and then we were like, okay, we're going back to V60.
Yeah.
Because it never disappoints, and I generally like the whole process of brewing over V60 and also having a V60. So, but nonetheless, your story about the comparison on why did you come back to V60?
So again, this kind of ties into how we originally connected and why I even called you up in the first place. Was that the description that you had given for your sensory experience of the coffee actually perfectly, more or less, I remember matching mine. That's where we actually got into Kogilala, remember orange candy. So
yeah, because so for me it's obviously roasting and cupping the coffees and then resting them, and I generally tend to take one more step wherein I try to brew the coffee also, because brewing, I feel, is also a very important step which adds a lot of value to the whole cycle or the life cycle of coffee. Yeah.
Well, that's your real world representation of how the coffee is going to be consumed.
So you're back to V60 and the light roasted naturals.
I'm generally nowadays what I actually do is I brew it both on V60 and on B75. So B75 is a perfect middle ground between April, which would basically April or Kalita, but April has a much faster flow rate, so they're like fully flat. B75 has a 75-degree angle. So it has that angle that you get from a V60. At the same time, it still has a flat bottom.
Okay.
And the flow rate is extremely fast.
Oh.
That allows you to grind the coffee faster, finer rather. So, and again, while I say that I would default to say a V60, like I said, a couple of months ago, my default was to go to B75. I keep switching between them because every now and then what happens is, okay, I've got this coffee. This is how I'm brewing this currently. Every now and then I'm like, I didn't change anything, but now the coffee tastes different. I would go to B75, check it out, what has changed, what has not changed. So even when it comes to brewing coffee, even though this is like my preferred equipment, the actual recipe, the brewing method, everything changes over the life cycle of the coffee. As the coffee ages, there are some coffees which require you to grind finer.
Of course.
To be able to extract more. There are some coffees which actually require you to reduce the water ratio and increase the flow rate, reduce the contact time to still keep extracting that sweetness. Coffees go both ways in my experience.
So when we talk about V60, do you have any preference? Like, does the glass or the ceramic or the plastic make a difference?
Yeah, but not. Now this is going to be weird. I haven't again spoken to anybody who has mentioned this part yet.
Okay.
I absolutely hate glass. This is part of the reason why I can't get myself to use the switch, even though switch actually has a lot of like switch could be your default method and you'd be set for life.
Absolutely.
Right? But it is glass, so I can't use it as my daily brew.
Now that you mentioned that you hate it, I don't want to say that I generally recommend that as a brewer.
No, it is absolutely fantastic as a brewing method. Yeah. See, that's where we are in agreement. Yeah. And I remember having this conversation with you. I tested out a lot of switch recipes. They tend to be much easier than actually V60 recipes.
Because if you want to replicate something, it just makes your job easy.
Speaking of which, from my earlier point of coffees changing their recipes over time, a lot of coffees start brewing better once you have some amount of immersion, which you can do via switch.
Exactly.
But the problem is, again, glass, not the heat retention or any of those things that people generally talk about. I need friction.
Okay.
So here's the thing. Back when I started brewing pour overs, once I got a V60, and I'm like, so this actually ties into how I got into V60. It's like, okay, I've played around with the Aeropress a lot. There are lots of YouTube channels suddenly talking about specialty coffee. There are now suddenly specialty coffee roasters in India who are selling interesting coffees. and everybody seems to be going like speaking about V60. Okay, let me try a V60. And then by that time, I think V60 was selling in India. I got a ceramic one. That was the only one available back then, if I remember correctly. Started playing around with it, and like, okay, this brews a very different cup from an Aeropress. So yeah, this is something I'd like to pursue. And again, I think V60 brings out those acidic and sweet flavors,
Yes.
especially the acidic ones, better. And from those honey processed coffees, I think that acidity really made a difference in the final output. So again, I got to the V60 and so on.
Glass, ceramic, plastic.
Glass, ceramic, plastic,
Yeah.
right? So this was
Friction is what you would.
yes. At this point, like I said, a lot of YouTube channels coming up, and then you had this entire thing about flat bed. How do you ensure that your coffee bed is flat at the end of
Yeah.
your brewing process,
Yeah.
right? There was a lot of importance placed to this, and one of the narratives was you can't have any coffee sticking to the side of the
Yes.
filter, because then you're just wasting coffee. That coffee is not getting brewed properly.
Hmm.
And over the years, I've come to the realization that coffee sticking to the filter is the most important bit.
Is it?
Here's the thing: your coffee bed is like, say, especially in a V60, it's like this is your coffee bed, right? This triangle at the
Yeah.
bottom. This has much more resistance than coffee, like water flowing down the sides.
Hmm.
So this is what people call bypass. If you pour in a certain way, if you brew in a certain way and use the natural characteristics of the coffee, in this scenario, we are talking about the lightness or density of the coffee. So if you notice, when you're pouring, some of the coffee will float on top of the water. Sometimes
Yes.
the coffee will just mix with the water, and then you have this very nice homogeneous kind of a mixture slurry in the cup, in the brewer. Those things actually make a difference to the recipe and how the coffee extracts. Part of what nobody, I can't say nobody, there's specifically one small YouTube channel which had a video on this. I don't have the link, unfortunately,
No
but
problem.
they were actually talking about how coffee sticking to the side of the filter makes a difference. And I'm like, okay, that's an interesting take.
I think some of it does, right? Unless and until you're pouring water directly onto the paper, I think that's going to happen. Yeah.
Yes, because your water always finds the path of least resistance. Let's say, I'm not a physicist, but logically that would make sense. If there is so much coffee at the bottom that the water has to flow through, all that water sitting on top of the coffee is going to find other ways. So it's going to bypass the coffee anyway. At which point, if you pour the coffee well, if you take care of the technique, develop the technique, you can actually have coffee on all sides. So water never comes directly in contact with the paper. Now my frustration with glass is, there is glass being the worst offender in this case. Preference being ceramic, it has the most friction, followed by plastic, but I don't like handling plastic, so it's like a personal preference thing. Glass doesn't have any friction.
Hmm.
So all there's like barely any coffee sticking to the sides, which means I can't cover the sides. Basically, I want a dome like this, like an inverted dome like this. So there's like a bowl of coffee in which my water is sitting, and the water is always supposed to go through all the coffee. That naturally takes care of the bypass. Some bypass is okay, it's really undetectable to the palate. It might make a difference in, say, a refractometer. I don't have one, I don't need one, because I'm a home brewer.
Understood.
Right? So this is where actually my preference for material comes in. I love handling glass and ceramic,
Okay.
but again, now this is where the switch is also actually useful. Because in a switch, you're trapping the water, right?
Yeah.
So even if it bypasses, there's that section at the bottom where the water probably has to flow through anyway. The thing you need to take care of course, is the likelihood that it might over extract stuff at the bottom, but it gets balanced with the under extraction probably somewhere in the middle or at top of the bed. Again, like, these are fluid dynamics or whatever you call it. The only way we measure that as a brewer is, what's the output in the cup? Do I sense this? Do I sense that?
Yeah.
So you develop those senses and check, can I vary this variable, and does that make difference to the coffee, and so on. That's how you develop as a brewer. So getting back to this particular point, in a switch, because you are immersing, it doesn't really matter if the coffee is sticking to the side or not. It generally makes less of a difference than in a normal V60 brew.
So you're saying that your choice of brewer would be a ceramic V60,
Yes.
but you can also work with a glass switch.
Specifically for recipes that would call out the
But
immersion
yeah,
part.
first preference is a ceramic V60.
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Again, this is technique, depends on the coffee. Like I said, some coffee is going to float on top of the water, some
But
coffee
ceramic
is not.
V60 is something that you have brewed probably, let's say, 100 times, and 90 times you were not disappointed, something like that.
No, that honor actually goes to the B75.
Oh,
A whole different ballgame.
now I'm confused. Which is your preferred brewer?
V60
Okay, and ceramic.
for the flavors, but that is after I have developed my technique to be able to use it properly.
Okay.
Right? So during this period where even a couple of years ago when I was still figuring out a lot of technical details like these, B75 or even April, they have this, that like the flatbed brewers have an advantage. One, the heat properties of the ceramic around them don't really interfere because the filters are ridged, right? So the filters never stick to the sides. Whereas in a V60, the filter is sticking to the sides.
Obviously.
So now your airflow is impacted because there's not enough gap between those ridges, not as much. Like V60 has those ridges for a reason, right?
Yeah.
So that naturally affects the flow rate. Plus, because of the conical shape, probably the coffee at the bottom is getting over extracted while the one at the top is not. So that's always a balancing act that you need to do. So in my experience, as a general take, it is very easy to over extract in a V60 as opposed to say a flatbed brewer. So B75, as I said, to me is the perfect middle ground. I have not had a single cup go bad on the B75. That could not be fixed by simply changing the grind size. You don't have to worry about technique on a brewer like B75. Just April has this default recipe for their April brewer, right? The 3 pours and you're done. Use the same recipe, you basically get 90% of the way there. After all that, everything is just grind size. And another thing is, because the brewer is very narrow, you don't even need a perfect pouring technique. You can just do a center pour and be done with it.
Oh, okay.
The coffee sticking to the side parts is taken care of by the natural friction of the paper filter, because in those ridges the coffee gets trapped and you automatically have this dome that I was talking about, in which the water makes contact with the
Something
coffee.
for us to brew and see.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's do a V60 versus a V75.
But there is always that downside. V60 will give you, or in my experience, has always given me a punchier brew. So if you want a more mellow and
obviously it comes down to your personal preference also. Like if you're looking for flavors, you're looking for body, you're looking for acidity. What are you looking for? Clarity in the cup. So okay, interesting. But B75 would be your answer.
Nobody seems to be talking about it other than some people on Reddit.
You mind telling our audience where exactly to buy, which one to buy, and how much will it cost?
See, here's the problem, right? It's not available to buy readily in India. I had to get one. Either you buy it on AliExpress, have it shipped to the USA or something, or get it to India directly.
Okay.
I had some issues with AliExpress.
How did you end up getting yours?
I found it on AliExpress. Then, for some reason, my DuckDuckGo search landed me on a Time or Australia's official website where they're officially selling a B75.
Okay.
So I have lots of people who stay in Australia. I've got one with them.
So a couple of favors and a couple of research got you there.
Yep.
But if there is a more defined way of getting it, let us know. We'll add it to the comment section or the description of the video.
I think there's only one importer selling a B75 kit in India, but I don't need the kit. I just needed the brewer. Oh, and by the way, it's also made from Triton, so it's like plastic, but better quality plastic that I don't mind handling. I like the feel of it. It's really sturdy. Like I've dropped it from like 5 feet or something. It has not even chipped it.
Okay, great.
And it goes in the dishwasher pretty well. So there's that.
Perfect. Interesting.
Not a product placement, by the way.
No, that's completely okay. So moving on to our third question. Again, a very simple, but yet it could be a very complicated question. So, Mrugesh, what would you prefer? A hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee?
90% of the times hot cup.
Okay.
There are similar to
I think that would be like an answer that rolls off of your tongue, right? If you were to ask me also, I would say like a hot cup of coffee. But then why hot? Like, why not cold? Like I meet a lot of people on a daily basis. I see people having cold brews or iced pour overs in winters, in summers, or in monsoons also. So I have always wondered that why am I having hot coffee 365 days, wherein I'm seeing a majority of the people inclining towards an iced pour over. So why did you immediately say a hot cup of coffee?
Because I'm brewing, those naturals would bring out the sweetness and the acidity.
Oh, trust me. See, the other day, I was brewing. Someone shared a recipe with me about again a fermented naturals that I was brewing, lactic fermentation naturals to be precise. A very good recipe. I did a ice pour over, and I actually liked it. It was so. How was it different from a hot pour over? Is all I could get in that cup of coffee was sweetness and body. But what it was missing was what comes with the hot coffee is that satisfaction, that acidity, and probably
Complexity.
different flavors and complexity. Yeah, that's the right way to say it. But I liked it. Maybe it was the weather, maybe it was something different I tried, but it also kind of made me like a 70-30% now. Like 70% of the times I'll have a hot cup of pour over, but 30% of the time maybe I'll go for a nice pour over also. So the reason I'm asking that is because the answer just rolls off of the tongue that I want to have a hot cup of pour over, but I don't think we give enough chance or credit to a colder beverage also.
Probably. See, I know for a fact that I don't like cold brews in general.
Okay.
I just find that flavor profile to be too muted.
But you can make it your own way, right? Like, let's say, rather than keeping for 12 hours, you keep it for 10 hours or you keep it for 16 hours. Rather than keeping it refrigerated, you can leave it at room temperature. Maybe the water you use will make a difference.
Probably, but okay, let me put it this way. There's a reason, sir, we prefer some foods hot and some foods cold, right? The hot foods, the heat actually brings out certain aroma compounds or flavor compounds that you can't otherwise taste when the food is cold.
Yeah, I think that's the Indian way of having food, right? Always have your food hot, always heat your food. Always have cooked food rather than having cold food.
Not really. I mean, I love salads. I eat a lot of raw foods as well. I actually love non-spicy, so-called bland foods that we would say like just a basic a sprig of rosemary in the butter, and then you have rice on that, and that I'm good with that.
Okay.
That's it.
Why a no to cold?
Because in coffee, I'm looking for those specific flavors. And again, I'm not saying I have generally tend to prefer. This actually warrants re-examining, I think, at this stage, because it's been a few years since I've had cold brew. I think the last time I had cold brew was when we were doing that experimentation around, I think, tasting for the cold brew to be served here at the cafe. Submarine, was it?
Yeah, the submarine fermentation.
Yep. So anyway, I liked it. It's not like that I didn't like it. It's just
I think you don't dislike it, but you won't prefer it.
Prefer it. And okay, as I said, I think this bears some re-examination at this point of where I am and
that's what I was trying to say. That we need to give it. We need to keep an open mind and probably need to have more cold brews and have more ice pour-overs. At least that is what I've started doing.
Yeah. Part of it is also, though, I think, now that we've just mentioned it, like because you just mentioned varying the recipes for the cold brew, I just enjoy brewing. I don't get that satisfaction in a cold brew. I love the brewing process. That's like my daily meditation every morning.
Okay, that's a good answer. That's an acceptable answer.
Yeah. I get the similar satisfaction from an ice brew, like because I have to still go through that brewing process, and then there is always that mental satisfaction of I'm an engineer by nature, so I like tinkering around, right?
Okay.
So I love like varying these variables, and I'm like, okay, if I've got like say 100 grams of ice, how much will I need to adjust the grind size and the water ratio to be actually not over extract the coffee and still get that sweetness in the Yet I need some body. Okay, I need to grind finer, but then how much finer? And so there's always that experimentation around.
Get it.
Sometimes, most times nowadays, I don't have the mental space to be able to do that. When I do, I love going through that process.
Got it.
So probably that's the answer, I think. And again, it's just that there are certain flavors, and see, I'm not a Q grader. My palate from my childhood has been a typical Indian palate. It's just that once I started cutting out sugars, and then the palate has evolved a bit.
Likewise,
now that I can
yes.
taste the coffee.
Yeah.
That part is always going to make a difference. That Indian palate, I think, makes a lot of difference, especially if you're too used to eating spicy food. So part of this goes into why not sugar is like why sugar helped me develop this flavoring for coffee is there's this theory, although in practice it does work that way in my experience, but I'm not a scientist, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. That the natural sweetness, the most natural sweetness that your body would normally be able to associate with is, let's say, hapus mango. That's like one of the sweetest flavors that you can have naturally in nature.
Mhm.
Sugar is many times sweeter than that, not to mention it is a direct source of glucose.
Yeah.
So your blood sugar. That is what your body craves as sugar input. Once you start cutting that out, your body then starts exploring these different,
Yeah.
tastes, and I think somebody
Like you said, right, then you find your milk sweeter in your cappuccino.
Exactly.
You find your pour over sweeter.
I-
It really always has been there, but you have tried. You've now sensing it more, now experiencing it.
the senses open up.
Yeah.
And again, this is, I think, directly plays into what you're saying about re-examining, say, cold brew here. Maybe my senses have just got to a point where I am so used to a certain thing that anything else feels unnatural or doesn't fit into that mold. And I do this experiment every now and then. There comes a time, let's say every month or every couple of months, where I just go only dark roasts. Reset my palate.
But that's again hot, or you're experimenting?
No, I love dark roasts with ice brews, or
Nice.
probably would love them. Like I love here's something I noticed, like sugary sweetness, I would associate with cold.
Uh-huh.
I like my milk desserts cold. I don't like hot milk flavors.
Okay.
So through this process of changing my palate, changing my diet, there is always this flavor profile, and okay, I can sense like these flavors. There's like peach and almond and all of those things that
That's how you
they're on the
associate.
labels, right? At some point in time, I stopped paying attention to those things. We can talk about why.
When you like a
because
cup,
that's
you like a cup. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually this is something interesting that we could discuss, how I select my coffee in the first place. But anyway, there was a time when I used to pay attention to those things just to check whether my palate was able to sense any of those things. And then I noticed something interesting. So my wife if I present her an anaerobic, the fermented flavor to her tastes like jackfruit
Okay.
or cashew fruit.
Okay.
Because that is the profile that her palate or her brain has associated with since childhood. So if you tell her like, this is supposed to be like apricot, nah, I can taste cashew in this. Like the cashew fruit, not the cashew nut.
Yeah.
So I actually I dialed back a little bit from being very specific about those flavors towards more what am I experiencing. I remember some roasters having this stuff like strawberry jam sandwich or something like in their flavor. I'm like, initially it's like, that doesn't make any sense. And then I'm like, no, that actually makes a lot of sense, except that it's a very personal experience for the person who has written those flavor notes.
Yeah.
That it probably
to an
reminds
extent it is subjective. That's why it happens. It's not what one Q grader or what one cupper would say, but it would rather be what multiple people are saying, and then you average it out. So, but yes, it kind of to an extent is subjective, but not necessarily subjective. But yes, some can be derived from the past experiences also.
And that I think also has I don't think I can ever be a Q grader. One, because I'm not paying attention to these things. Secondly, what is a stone fruit? I have no idea what a stone fruit is, right? And yet there are coffees like over the years I've seen where the Q grader has rated in, oh, this has a jasmine and stone fruit and whatnot. So nowadays what I fall back on is, okay, if this has a tea-like property, I probably might not like this coffee, but is it like upfront or is it towards the end where it gets that property?
That's a nice way of looking at things, and that's the right approach, I would say. Okay. Anyways, I think we are going to talk about that as well. So my next question to you, Mrugesh, would be, what are the can you just to our audience tell 3 brewing techniques that you are very fond of, or 3 brewing techniques that are new to you or you recently tried? Like 3 brewing techniques. I think one could be your B75, I guess. And so far, if I have to make a list, I think with Mrugesh, we are going to try a B75, we are going to try a washed coffee over a Moka pot, and then we are going to do ice pour over versus hot pour over.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Although, again, for ice pour overs, I've generally leaned towards Aeropress.
Okay. So your 3 brewing methods are not like the classics, maybe anything new or which you have been recently.
What I would suggest is nobody should be missing out on the Moka pot.
Okay.
It is so versatile and it is so easy to recommend to anybody.
Does it make a difference, by the way, if I buy a biletti or I don't buy a biletti, as in the original one?
I actually go for so my wife actually has a biletti.
Yeah.
She actually was in Italy at some point and bought it in Italy.
Okay.
So she has an actual biletti, but
I'm not sure whether that makes a difference or not.
It doesn't. I don't think so. It's just a cost difference is a lot.
Okay.
Especially nowadays, I think.
Okay.
I have been using a stainless steel Moka pot.
Oh, okay.
All these years, like past 2 or 3 years.
Just buy it off of Amazon.
We have some Indian brands manufacturing it.
Oh, nice.
Works on induction. I have not tried it on induction, but works on induction. Yes.
Nice. Definitely let me know.
Goes in a dishwasher.
I'll add it to the description of the video.
Yeah. Goes in a dishwasher.
Okay.
I've already gifted it to like 7 or 8 people.
Nice.
So works like a charm. I go for a bigger capacity. I like more coffee, like a lower water to coffee to what? Lower or higher? More coffee, less water.
So like 20 grams of coffee?
Yeah, I generally, nowadays mostly all my recipes go for 19 or 20 grams. Okay. I've even stopped trying to like micromanage the recipe sizes. See, most of the times I'm getting coffee 150 grams, 200 grams of 250 grams, right? It's easy to go for 19 or 20 grams. So you get like 250 grams, you get 13 cups out of that package by going from 19.2 or 19.3 or something. If you get a 150 gram package, again somewhere around 19 is where you get it. If you get 500 grams, it's easy to go for 20 grams and so on and so forth.
So what's your stainless steel Moka pot method?
So I just go for 20 grams of coffee there most of the times. Here's the interesting bit. Because I have a WDT tool and a tamper, I use both.
Of course. I think that's
because I have them, okay? Yeah. My father-in-law...
generally you can just, for people who don't have it...
You don't need them.
Yeah. No, as in you can tap your portafilter, try to get rid of the air pockets or the molders is what you call it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
But I think for an espresso, a WDT and a tamper is the right combination. But if you don't have a WDT tool, then definitely try to just over the counter, just try to tap your portafilter because that will take care of your air pockets and molders. Yep. I think that for me works.
Just get it as level as possible. See, here's the thing. Here's the best and the worst part about a Moka pot. You can't really control the water flow as such. Sometimes even with a well-tamped bed of coffee in there, it's going to the water sometimes comes off at an edge because hey, your cooking counter is slightly tilted. That's the best part about Moka pot though. You can't control all these
That's
variables.
why in the beginning I said Mrugesh is a very serious brewer because I've never heard anyone talking about a tilted countertop.
So I can show you like the super.
Let's start adding to that recipes. You should first figure out whether your countertop is leveled or not.
I actually got my architect to do that, by the way. we had a water level gauge over there, but unfortunately my stove is on the other counter, which has a slight. Anyway, it doesn't really matter.
You just made the whole brewing experience a lot more expensive now. Now we need to call our architects and
But
just
this
check whether
is-
it's level or not.
Yes, but this is again why we need a mocha pot. Everybody has to try a mocha pot.
Okay.
You don't really care about any of these things with the mocha pot. See, at the end of the day, once that coffee is brewed and you know how to get to that point by managing your temperature or the amount of coffee to water and how much time, like I think the interesting bit about the mocha pot is it levels everything out.
Okay.
It goes in a very specific, say, output.
So what is that exact recipe? What are you saying? 20 grams of coffee?
20 grams of coffee. Now this particular mocha pot I'm using, I think my output comes around to,
How much water are you adding?
I cut off at around 200 grams, I think.
So 20 grams of coffee, 200 grams
I'm
of
not
water.
measuring this, by the way. Only
Okay.
thing I'm measuring is coffee.
And the outcome that you're getting is?
Around 200 grams of water.
Okay.
Because that, again, I'm not measuring that. I know because of how much it fills
So are
my
you
cup up.
diluting it further or you're having it as is?
Depends on the coffee. Generally, I don't need to dilute it, but depends on the coffee.
So,
And the only thing I would say is works a lot better for me when the heat is actually medium high. So if a couple of years ago, I think Wired Gourmet had this interesting mocha pot recipe out. James Hoffman followed after that, and his mocha pot recipe actually references Wired Gourmet as well.
okay.
So he was actually brewing a mocha pot on an induction. So on an induction, he was constantly having to reduce the heat and then place the mocha pot on heat again, and so on and so forth. And that's how he managed the heat and then got the desired output from the mocha pot. On a gas stove that we normally have in our houses over here, we don't need to. But very interestingly, I put it at medium, so long as the flame doesn't envelop the mocha pot, right? And I put water at around 60 to 70 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
Into the mocha
Not
pot.
boiling hot.
No. 60 to 70 degrees Celsius water into the mocha pot, and for 20 grams of coffee, I get around 150 to 200 ml output depending on the coffee. But I cut it out at the bubbling phase. So once if you keep the mocha pot open, see water that's pouring out, the moment it starts going only, it looks basically like water with bubbles.
Yeah.
You cut it off,
Understood.
immediately take it under the tap and stop the brewing. That's the part at which I get the best output. And again, slanted counter or not, mocha pot evens everything out.
Understood.
That's why I feel it's the easiest method for anybody to get to. I mean, my father-in-law, who's like, 75 at this point, he brews with a mocha pot every day, and I love his coffee.
Yeah, I think mocha pot and French press somehow has made way into, I would say, most of the houses in our country. Definitely, for sure. And it's also easier to buy, right?
Yeah.
And I think the approach is
Actually,
it's not that difficult.
Easier to buy is slightly debatable right now because of the cost. Unless you find like an Indian manufacturer who's manufacturing those things, then the cost is manageable. Otherwise, the realities go
Do
for.
let us know because we are going to add that to the description.
Okay.
Anyways, your second brewing method.
I would go with an Aeropress.
Okay.
Again, versatility. And again, you know my preference.
The biggest debate is inverted or not.
No, just get a Prismo.
Oh, okay.
I stopped the whole inverted
Your
thing.
approach, please take it ahead. What would be the approach to Aeropress?
This needs testing. I'm not sure if it actually makes that much of a difference or not. The reason I don't go for inverted is because I don't want all that almost boiling hot water to come in contact with the silicone or the rubber.
Yeah.
That's my health concern with it.
Yeah.
And Prismo solved that for me. The advantage with the Prismo is you get a fine mesh filter, like a metal filter, and you can also use a paper filter on it. I have sometimes even used a double paper filter in, by the way, for a mocha pot, double paper Aeropress filters, stick it under the mocha pot, what is that called? Sieve. You're golden.
Double. Oh, okay.
2 filters. The
One
normal
more thing added to our list to try.
the normal Aeropress filters that we use,
Yeah.
not the AC or some other branded filters. The normal Aeropress filters, I think, are too thin. They don't soak in too much, like as much as oil as I. So again, I'll get back to the Aeropress bit, but the interesting bit again here is from the Moka pot output, if you want, see again, naturals, right? Or even slightly darker roast, not necessarily lighter roasts. But I like the clarity.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, the paper is going to help you with that.
Yeah. When I want body, I actually tend to go for an Aeropress nowadays. Unless I'm going straight up to espresso. But
so double paper is for both?
Aeropress, you have to be a little careful with the double paper. Not every time will it work. Too much pressure has to be imparted. Whereas
so
for
will
Moka
the
pot,
coarseness of the coffee?
Yes, it does
help?
affect
Yeah.
that. Yeah. If the coffee is a little coarse, you can afford double filters, but you
so
generally
how much
don't
grams
need
of coffee are you taking for your Aeropress?
Again, I brew generally with a 20 gram.
20 grams is across.
Yeah, so at one point I was wearing all these recipes, and then I ended up getting into coffee management. I actually needed to keep track of, okay, so this package is now, okay, this is like 150 grams, I can divide it by X.
Nothing wrong with that.
I don't have the mental space to calculate that every day now.
Okay, so 20 grams of coffee, not the inverted method.
No.
What is the amount of water? Prismo as an attachment, and what's the amount of water?
Here's the best part. I eyeball the Moka pot, the Aeropress nowadays.
You?
I just go eyeball the Aeropress.
Oh. Or you go by the indication that's there on?
Generally, but...
so like 3 or 4, what is the mark that you stop?
Somewhere between 3 or 4.
Okay. I think that's 230, 240 ml.
That's, no, it's not. On a normal Aeropress, I think that comes around 180.
Oh, okay.
I think between 3 and 4 comes around to 180.
And then what time would you wait until you press?
2 minutes. James Hoffman's Aeropress recipe is actually golden.
Okay.
Don't need anything more than that actually. See, here's the thing. Now that I'm talking about this, simplification has been the game for me for the past few years.
Yeah, of course. So see, I to whoever who's interacting with me, or whenever I'm talking to a brewer, or even for myself, I always say that investing in the number of equipments or the total number of equipments you own really does not make a difference. Rather, you should choose one or stick to one, and then simplify the recipe as much as you can, and get that cup that you like. That cup that you like is more important than you trying something new, or you trying a different recipe, or you trying a different brewer. Defeats the whole purpose of the conversation that we are having here, because you're experimenting so much with a B75 or a B60 or an Aeropress. Like, yes, those experiences are important, but what happens is generally when I talk to a brewer, they're like, okay, I bought this, 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 and now I know that the 6th brewer that I bought is eventually what is my daily driver. So I actually haven't been able to figure this out, that how can I save the time and effort and the money of a brewer and myself to buy that 6th brewer in the first place. So that is kind of, I feel, is a problem that needs to be solved. It's not a problem, but
okay.
In the journey of you using 6 brewers, I think you learn a lot also. But I think you could have avoided that.
Yes.
And stick to the 6th brewer to eventually get the cup that you like.
Yeah, but again, for me, like I said,
because
tinkering around is part of the
whole
pleasure.
Concept about, like I said, I've always been saying, Indian specialty should be only and only for the flavor. Like, have Indian specialty coffee for its flavor and chase the flavor that it provides. It should not be about how many equipments you have. I understand that everyone wants a brew bar setup and it should look good, but it should also not give a wrong message that I need to own so many equipments in order to get a good cup of coffee, because the good cup of coffee is the cup of coffee what you like.
Yep. And here's the interesting bit. The recipes that we create are to be able to reproduce that cup that you like.
Yeah.
The recipe
I would rather say
meaningless.
experiment a lot and create 10 recipes rather than having 10 brewers and 1 recipe.
But that naturally, like I said earlier, right, it naturally occurs during the life cycle of consuming a coffee for me.
Yeah.
So this kind of gets into another tangent.
So there are 3 factors, right? Like, you have equipments, you have coffee, and you have recipes. You can skip the equipment part, rather choose one equipment, but choose multiple coffees and multiple recipes. I think that's the best way to go about it. Yeah.
See, again, Moka pot is going to. Here's the thing, okay. I would sum up this journey this way. Like looking back at where I started and where I am now. It's like a bell curve, right? There's a bulge in the middle where you're experimenting with so many different things and trying to figure out and experiment, because that experimentation itself is pleasurable, like I said. Then there comes a time where you've figured out, okay, this is what I want to focus on primarily. I don't necessarily have the time to, or my priorities have changed to be able to experiment that much. I don't necessarily enjoy that experimentation anymore. I mean, I still do, but that's also a valid thing to say, right?
Yeah.
You evolve as a person, your tastes evolve, everything changes. Something like COVID happens, and then suddenly everything changes about your life, and so on and so forth, right? At some point, for me, it became more important to simplify, go towards the most reproducible output, and my senses are now trained enough. I can literally lift up. So I have a thermos next to my counter, right? So it generally has like 65 degrees Celsius of water, because that's the temperature I need when I'm drinking hot water.
Okay.
So what I generally do is when I'm getting that water for coffee, I'll pour it from the thermos into the kettle and then get it to the temperature. I can literally lift up the thermos and say, oh, this doesn't have 350 ml of water, I need more water. That's how trained my senses are at this point in time, to be able to just lift up the thermos and say this does not, or this has 350 ml of water. Why 350 ml? Generally, I need 350 ml.
Got it.
For the 20 grams, right? Point is not to learn different equipment. Point is to train your senses.
Correct.
For me, that journey happened through different equipment, which is again fair enough, because Moka pot gives you a different output. And I actually came back to the Moka pot after having used V60 and an Aeropress for a number of years. And then my wife really preferred a Moka pot, so we met just after COVID or something like that, or during COVID. So whenever I used to visit her place, I used to get coffee from a Moka pot. I'm like, this is an interesting profile. This is like different. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. A lot of snobbery actually drops out of that once you start really enjoying the output, right? You start paying attention to these things. What connects with you? I like this characteristic of this coffee. Doesn't make the coffee good or bad. Although I do have a bone to pick about Vienna and French roast, but that's a different matter. Yeah. But this is, see, the pleasure is in that coffee that you're drinking, the experience of drinking, the experience of making. And as I said, the simple differentiation between plastic and ceramic for me is I don't like holding plastic. I love the sensory experience of brewing with ceramics.
That's something.
Yeah,
personal. That's your preferred.
I would simplify the entire process. I would say the reason again I'm stating, start with the Moka pot, learn an Aeropress, and then get a pour over. Could be a V60, V75, whatever you want.
Third preferred brewer would be a V60.
You should not be missing out on the pour over flavor.
Of course.
Yeah, and V60 is the easiest to get. The filters are reasonably sized, available everywhere. You can play around a lot with it. I would have gone with the B75 had availability and the filter cost were not an issue, but it is, unfortunately.
Of course.
So V60 wins hands down over there. And these are three different kinds of, say, brewing profiles that give you this, if you pay attention, appreciation for these different characteristics in your cup of coffee. Because they highlight different things. Right now, I probably would not be able to say what they specifically highlight, because that's not been my mental, that's not how I've been looking at coffee for these years now, like a couple of years.
I'm glad you brought that topic, because that was my next question. And I think it's the most common question for a lot of people, including me, including you, everyone. So how do you buy your Indian specialty coffee? Like, is there a process you follow? How does Mrugesh or any Indian brewer would buy? Or can you help simplify that whole process?
Partly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. So, when I'm drinking this, I don't know what the origin is. I don't know where the coffee comes from. I don't know anything about this coffee, right? My prime criteria here is, do I like this or not? If I do like this, then you think a little bit more about what do I like, what I maybe could have used differently. Now, as a brewer, I also start thinking, is there more potential that I can extract from this? Maybe, I think maybe change the grind size a little bit. And again, this comes from experience and you develop your senses for it. But specifically with regards to whether I'd buy this, coffee or not, yeah, sure, because it has the right balance of acidity, sweetness, bitterness for me that I like from this coffee. So this is now, okay, let's say me as a person who has not brewed this coffee, coming to a cafe, testing this at the cafe, brewed well, pretty good, not under extracted, not over extracted. I like the balance. I'm going to try this out, right? And again, okay, maybe this was an anaerobic that was brewed in a certain way that enhances those, say, fermented flavors in the output.
So obviously that would be one way. Like you go to a friend's place or you go to a cafe, you have that cup of coffee, and then you're intrigued and you want to know more about that coffee, and then the brewer will tell you this is the bag. Go ahead and buy it.
Yep.
So that's one way. But most of us, I think, are sitting home or sitting in our office and we want to buy online, shop online. So
Exactly.
what would be the process, or what is the process that you follow to eventually choose your brand of coffee?
I know what characteristics I prefer. Now, this cup is actually getting to that point. How this got there, right? So, when I started Aeropress, specific recipes, okay, try these different coffees, not too much variety in the coffees either. So, for me, that was very helpful because I actually, it's like an open world video game kind of thing. It's like you get into it with a very specific small quest. It tells you how the gameplay generally is, what are the aspects of the game that you might, or and then it suddenly gets you into a wider open world there where all of this expands. I had a very similar experience with coffee. Got it into a very funneled kind of a way whereby limited brewers, limited number of coffees, not too much variety, and then suddenly you get a different variety, you start tasting them and so on. I would say start with the simplest thing. If you have a cafe available, you go there, but the question is online, right?
Yeah.
I say, what makes you attracted to the coffee in the first place? Do you like the bitterness of the coffee, or do you enjoy the complexity of the coffee? I think that is the most basic question anybody could start with in India.
Like for me, a brewer sitting at home, I am down to my last 20 grams. I need to buy a new bag of coffee. I go to www.xxxgraysole.coffee. I open the website. Now I have 20 or 25 options to choose from. So
Right.
How exactly do you make that choice?
Again, bitterness, acidity, sweetness. Nowadays, some roasters are actually putting that information across, in a way that you can filter. If you can't, scroll through the entire thing. Always go through the entire thing before you narrow something down. Then take a look at the process. Process, and actually, if I look at this label, for example, right? You have broken this down into dry aroma, wet aroma, varietal altitude, and so on. Dry aroma, wet aroma, roast profile, characteristics. A fruity, juicy, wild coffee. Fine. Okay, that's interesting because I like fruity. Juicy actually has a different meaning for me than I think generally what Q graders use. I think juicy tends to mean juice-like. For me, juicy is like it's when you're biting into an orange and then it has that juice mixed with the pulp, and that kind of is what I get from juicy. So I have to mentally change that for me. Juicy means okay, this might be like a thinner body maybe, but juicy could also imply, along with fruity, it might be a sweet coffee.
Okay.
So take a look at the characteristics, sensory evaluation. Again, not everybody necessarily has the sensory evaluation listed. They would have say, okay, this coffee is like, blackberry aftertaste, tamarind sweetness.
I think which you mentioned a while ago is whether it's tea-like or it's fruity or what is the aftertaste could be a sort of an oversimplification, but that would help you choose your coffee.
Because you're narrowing down, right?
So you're saying scroll till the bottom.
Look at everything.
Check the characteristics.
Yes.
And third, simplify the sensory by figuring out whether it's tea-like or fruit-like and what is the aftertaste.
And then check the altitude.
check the altitude.
Higher the altitude, the coffee is generally going to be a bit more complex, or it probably have more sweetness.
But then more or less, I think the regions in India are 4,000 or
More or less.
4,500. Yeah,
Agreed.
3,000 is where it
Agreed.
starts from.
Yes.
So
But
altitude, yes, is the right way to judge an Arabica specifically, but not Indian specialty Arabica, I would say.
I guess yeah, because
Sure.
at the end of the day, that's like more or less the last characteristics that
I think at the beginning also you mentioned about your inclination towards honey or naturals. I think that's again a good indicator for you to choose your bag of.
Yeah, but I arrived there through a process, right?
Yeah.
What actually happened was, okay, I
So
like
it's the other
this
way around. The
coffee.
characteristics, sensory, then this, and then you are.
You are basically developing sensory patterns to be able to say, I like this in a coffee. This comes from, okay, this was a natural, this was an anaerobic, this was a honey process. It's a game of pattern matching to figure out this characteristic that I like is most prominent in this kind of a coffee, not present in a washed coffee. So I would generally gravitate towards these.
Okay.
I'm
You're basically choosing a coffee based on the information the roaster is providing and based on your inclination toward what kind of coffee do you want. But there could be
Yes.
other parameters. I have seen a lot of people, including me, who have on occasions chosen a coffee based on the brewer I have or based on the roast level.
Most definitely.
But I think I agree more with your answer about how to choose coffee, which is the first answer. But what about the people who are choosing based on brewer or based on the roast degree, the roast level of the coffee?
So here's the thing, I didn't mention roast degree. Now that you mention it, it actually strikes me that this is implicitly part of the pattern that I'm developing. Like I said, right?
Yeah, I think the characteristics you're looking for would generally point towards a lighter roasted coffee.
Exactly.
Get it. But what about the based on the brewer?
Okay, so this gets into a deeper discussion more towards.
Also, how do you?
Like what?
How do you choose
the,
based on the brewer? Like, let's say I have a V60, so then what coffee am I supposed to?
This is a rabbit hole.
I don't think there is a right answer to
There
that.
isn't. This is a rabbit hole.
Because the most common questions asked to us also as roasters, from what I've gathered, is that I have a V60 or I have an Aeropress or I have a Kalita. Please recommend me some coffee.
Yeah.
So there is a recommendation that goes from our side also, but I don't think there is a definitive answer. Like, we are able to give an answer. I wouldn't say the ideal answer because we are post roasting and cupping. Like I said, we are trying to brew the coffee also. So we might be able to give you a preference of coffee based on brewer, but that again would be a little bit subjective also. But yes, I get it. I think that's an information that you can rely on the roaster for rather than choosing it for yourself. I don't think there is a right answer for it.
No, but there might
Then
be
I
a
think
general guideline.
I think it brings me back to my discussion wherein try different coffees and try different recipes and you will figure out the answer yourself. Like, that is what I'm advocating for. Like, have your one favorite brewer, but don't have a favorite recipe. And keep trying different coffees. Is what I would say.
In general, I think recipes help. I can see that if you're starting out, you have a definitive guideline of, okay, try this, this should generally work.
1 gram here and there, 1 degree here and there also can change a recipe. Yeah.
It makes a lot of difference. Like yesterday, I think I started brewing, I started brewing Harley naturals.
The extended naturals.
Naturals, right? Before Harley, So Harley, I looked at a roast degree, and this is venturing out into the brewing part, but let's come back to again choosing the coffee discussion, right? I didn't actually check your roast profile. So for your coffee specifically, I'm not checking the roast profiles.
Okay.
Because again, I know that my sensory evaluation and yours is very, very much aligned. So I can trust your sensory evaluation and the description of the coffee that you have put on your website. That allows me to choose in your particular case.
Okay.
In that, I know I have a very definitive preference for, not anaerobics or not too fermented coffee or whatever. Even then, yeah, sure, I can try that and maybe put that in an Aeropress instead of like a V75 or a V60, which allows me more clarity, because then I don't want that. Or say, I probably wouldn't put heavily fermented coffee in a V60 nowadays, because it tends to highlight the uh, fermented flavors. Okay, so fine, but in your scenario, like when I'm buying a coffee on graceful.com, I can just look at, oh, okay, this is a sensory evolution, I can get away with that. Works for me. Why? Because I know you as a roaster see the coffee in a very similar manner that I do. And this is an unmentioned part that eventually gets to, I have like 4 or 5 roasters. I can call them up and basically say, hey, you just launched this coffee, do you think it's for me? And that roaster is able to say, nah, probably not for you. This is a more winey flavor. Don't get into it. I know you'll hate it. I've had these conversations before.
So that's another way of choosing a coffee. Call
Develop a
call the
relationship.
person.
It's a small community.
Okay.
Yeah, there is always this scope of directly talking to people, especially if you're in something like CVC.
Yeah.
Get on Discord, talk to people. This is how I'm looking at coffee, and this is where again the
community is
very
one way of
Yes.
helping you figure out.
And this is where I think those coffee meetups can also be very helpful.
Okay.
Taste different things. This is how I'm evaluating this. This is how I like it, don't like it. Eventually, you develop a pattern. And even if you, let's say, live in a remote place where you don't have any of this available, fine. It's actually, you could say, I like a nice body in my coffee. Go with an Aeropress. You can literally get any coffee, and Aeropress will allow you to extract more body than say a V60.
Okay.
Naturally, you can just reduce the water ratio and be done with it. Change the grind size, obviously, to compensate for the water ratio. But in that sense, Aeropress is the most versatile.
Understood.
So if you have an Aeropress, you can literally go for any coffee. It should get you most of the way there. Then there are some coffees that you want more sweetness out of, or want more punchier flavors or acidity out of, in lieu of the complexity. Or maybe you want a little more clarity. Clarity generally means flatbread brewers, but V60 will get you again 90% of the way there.
So basically explore.
Yes, and there's also Moka pot in the equation now, right?
Yeah.
I think when you add those Aeropress filters to the Moka pot, you get a very different sensory experience from without using them, because those coffee oils are not present there anymore.
Yeah.
It reduces the body, but it lends a very nice clarity, but it just does tend to be more towards for the lack of a better term, a darker side.
Understood.
You get the same naturals. Let's say I'm brewing that Harley right now, right? It's a fairly light roasted coffee. I started with 93 degrees to brew that, ended up with, as you said, a degree of temperature here and there. 91 to 90 does make a difference.
Yeah.
Do you want to get into those variables is the question. Do you want to get into those complexities? Yeah, then definitely go for a V60. And this again ties into the equipment question again, in a roundabout way. Which equipment do you go for? What is your 6th brewer? Is it the V60, or is it like, are you going back to the Aeropress and say, this gives me the best flexibility, gets me most of the way there? Rest of the times, I'll just go to Chirag and ask him to brew me a coffee. Right? Yeah, like the cafe gets most of the way there for me, like on a V60 brew. I don't have the necessary mind space or the time or the effort to be able to prove that. But eventually, again, it's going to drop to your sensory experience. And that is the key. Develop that experience, start looking at the coffee so as to draw patterns from it that allow you to relate them back to all the information listed here.
Perfect. I think that's a good summary of that question. So, and I like that you brought up the whole community point, because then you can ask around and also decide what coffee do you want to buy.
Yep.
So that brings me to my second last question of this episode. Again, one is directed towards us or me directly, and one is again a pretty straightforward question. So my question to you would be, also question back to me would be that what suggestion or what feedback or would you like to give to the roasters, or would you like to be involved at some stage or at some level wherein your input can make a difference to the final cup?
To a degree, yes. Um, uh, the way I think about roasting, and this is a question I actually wanted to ask you,
Sure.
so I'm glad you brought this question to the table anyway, is, see, the reason I don't enjoy, okay, you're going through the cupping process, right? Cupping process is basically no human intervention as much as possible. Pour water on coffee, let it sit, take the output. This is like more or less zero agitation apart from the pouring of the water itself. In theory, it gets you the most neutral representation of the coffee possible. I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, you would probably do cupping at various, and I think you do mention that on some coffees where you do cupping at various roast levels and
there
change
is a
variables
section
and
called
all.
roaster thoughts.
Yes. So, okay, so obviously that happens. You are roasting the coffee differently, trying different variables. I have a feeling the thought process is very similar to mine as a brewer, whereby, okay, I think I like these characteristics in the coffee more. I know that by changing these roasting parameters, these characteristics can be highlighted, so I'm going to try that next.
See, for us as roasters, uh, it's fairly simple, but also not trying to oversimplify. Is that as roasters, our job is to find the true potential of the Arabica that we are trying to roast, and that's exactly what we are trying to do. And there are like a billion steps in between. So,
Yep.
but so my question to you was that how or where, what stage would you like to get involved, or what is the general suggestion or feedback that you have for a roaster?
So here's the thing. This is exactly what I'm also doing every time I'm experimenting with a recipe. What is the potential of this coffee that I can bring out? That is also my approach, and in that I think we are aligned. But the entire point about neutrality of the brewing method, I don't like French press because this is my perception. I haven't had French press for a long time, but okay, I need my coffee paper filtered. I don't enjoy the coffee oils being in the coffee too much. Espresso is a completely different, separate topic on that. But anyway, in espresso, I think those coffee oils being part of the output enhances the experience. But in a French press, you're basically the oils will sit in a layer on top of the coffee for the most part. They don't get mixed in, they don't gel in. So it's like not a cohesive output for me.
Yeah.
Plus, again, the reason I think V60 enhances those acidic or sweet flavors or brings those flavors out in a, let's say, a punchier output is because of those flow characteristics and the conical shape and all of those things, including how you're probably pouring the coffee. You don't get any of that in a French press, and I think your cupping method is essentially like a French press. Inherently, does that not imply that you are biased towards French press as the default brewing method? See, at the end of the day, when I'm talking as a brewer, my experience comes down to what's in here, right? What do I enjoy from here, and what in my next cup would I like to enhance?
Yeah.
Right? For a roaster, this seems a similar mindset. What is the potential of the coffee that I can bring out more? But you're inherently, in a way, biased towards French press being the brewing method. So would it not make sense to also, at those points of where you're exploring this potential of the coffee, to try different brewing methods?
Like we were discussing before, so it's not just the cupping that is what we are completely dependent on, but it's the sample roasting to cupping to eventually brewing also.
Yeah.
So for us, a process, a day in a life of a roaster, or what a roaster does is generally would uh, get the green bean lot. That also is basis of a lot of parameters. Then sample roast, and sample roasted multiple ways. Then cup the coffee, then rest the coffee, and then brew the coffee. So that's what we generally as roasters follow to be able to figure out what the final cup should be, and whether or not we were able to figure out the true potential of the coffee. So a series of chain reactions is what will lead us to eventually figure out what the final lot or how the final lot should be perceived, brewed by the brewer. So I feel that the brewers could be a part of that stage wherein the coffee is now roasted, now cupped, now well rested, and it's time to brew.
Yeah.
And that brewing can happen of the multiple roasts that have been done and well rested also.
Precisely my thought. Because I think, let's say, I don't know, can we estimate what is the most common brewing method? We probably can't. But
For
let's
me,
say
it's V60.
V60, yeah. I'm leaning towards
Yeah.
V60. Most specialty brewers would
Yeah.
lean towards V60. Beginners may not, but different. Anyway. So if you're saying that is your most common audience, and if we know for sure that a French press output is different from a V60 output in these characteristics, would it not make sense to involve V60 as part of that process as well? Or maybe even an Aeropress if you think a coffee is leaning more towards, say when you're tasting the coffee.
See, certainly we cannot have all brewers or
No.
like multiple brewing techniques. It has to be the top 3 brewers or the top 2 brewers, or a recipe that has been tried and tested for through multiple ways. So that
Yeah.
could be a sort of a guideline for the whole post-resting stage of brewing the coffee and then deciding what is the best lot to go ahead with.
My suggestion would be to, I think Moka pot and French press. See, these brewing methods, they generally have their own characteristics that they would impart to the output, and you can't control too many variables. The method that allows you to control most variables and vary the output by a large degree,
Yeah.
the largest degree possible, is generally pour over. And Aeropress actually allows that control, but Aeropress would probably,
Yeah.
depending on the brew method,
I think
extract more
Aeropress would
body.
be the right way to go
Middle
about
ground.
it. Yeah. Because we also need to keep in mind that not everyone has, like I said, the most common or the most used brewer.
And there is also something to consider. Pour over requires a lot, in my opinion, in terms of technique development.
Yeah, and also the most amount of things needed is you require a kettle, you require paper, then the brewer itself, and then you require the scale as well.
All of these variables, and actually on this particular topic of extracting the potential of the coffee as a roaster and checking out all these variables, like I would have a follow-up question of how you get from, say, a green bean to what kind of a roasting method should I apply to this or something. That's probably what you could term as a default recipe kind of a thing.
Yeah.
This is how I start.
Yeah. So I can answer that. See, in general, so if you have a highly fermented coffee, then the heat has to be lower. If you have for coffee that is not fermented at all, then you can have the heat lower, but you can also have the heat higher and not be at the risk of charring the coffee or losing the flavors in it. In the most simple way, I'm trying to answer that question.
Right.
But yeah, I'm glad. I think so. The involvement, I think, as roasters, then we need to put in more effort than we are already putting, and then have you be a part of that post-roasting brewing phase.
Which might also, especially if we're going for, let's say, if you think Aeropress makes the most sense, it is the most versatile in terms of the final brewer, like an actual person brewing the coffee. Aeropress is probably simpler than a V60 because it doesn't require much in the way of technique. It's easier to eyeball an Aeropress brew as opposed to a V60 brew. V60 probably needs a tighter control of all the variables to get the exact output you want, because of the way it can wildly change the output, right? If we go, let's say, hypothetically, say an Aeropress is involved in the process, it's also much easier for a consumer when they're buying the coffee to say, and I've actually done this. Now, this ties into how do I buy the coffee question, right? I actually check what the recommended brewing temperature for the coffee is. That gives me an idea of what kind of an extraction I might get from this coffee. If you're recommending 95 degrees, the coffee might be a little difficult to extract. I might start directly with a finer grind and lower the temperature. That goes into the brewing aspect.
Understood.
My point being, for an Aeropress, it might just be easier to communicate a more generic recipe that people are able to follow once they get the brewed coffee in hand.
Yeah, got it.
It might also, at some point, and again, I don't know from a roaster's perspective how feasible that might be, it might also be possible to produce lots that lean more towards, hey, this is the V60 recipe we recommend with brewing this. this is the kind of output we are trying to enhance when brewing from a V60. So this is the lot that we have roasted, which we like on a V60 when brewed in this particular fashion. Obviously, your grinder is going to make a difference. Your water is going to make a difference. All of those factors, we can't control those. But this is the, you could say probably as a roaster, it's easier to do that on an Aeropress, right? Because the grinder differences are going to matter less on an Aeropress because you have immersion.
Yeah, even I think that would be the most common brewer to do the whole.
And it's the most versatile as well. You can take it anywhere. You just need hot water. You can even manage the temperature differences. This again goes into brewing, but on an Aeropress, it's a simple matter of, is it tasting too bitter upfront? Reduce the temperature. Is it under extracted? Okay, slightly increase the temperature. Otherwise, it's okay. On a V60, it goes into how am I pouring? Do I need to Harley, right? No, sorry, it was Barbara actually. I initially started with a higher temperature, dropped down the temperature, and it's like, nah, it's under extracting. Okay, I need to pour faster and with more agitation, and that got me the output. These variables come in. If you are that serious and looking at all those factors in a V60 brew, they don't come into a.
I think this could also help in another way, wherein the ideal recipe of the lot can at least come out, if not the lot.
Exactly.
That would be.
And again, Aeropress is an equalizer.
Yeah, of course.
It's easier for people to follow, I think, from my experience, an Aeropress recipe than it is to follow a V60 recipe, because precisely the same point that you're trying to do with cupping, right? Remove the human element as much as possible. Remove the technical change, the technique related changes as much as possible from this coffee. And this is something after watching, say, people like James Hoffman talk about this on YouTube, is something I'd never actually considered directly. Water makes a lot of difference. I don't know which water you're cupping the coffee in. I may not get those same flavors because maybe that composition of water is required to enhance those flavors. We can't control those. Let's be realistic.
To an extent you can, but yes, not everyone has, and you cannot be so technical about water. But yes, to an extent you can figure out the ideal brand. Maybe you can invest 10 or 20 rupees in that bottle of water, and then you can brew that on a daily basis.
Yeah, but you wouldn't expect anybody. Even today, I have not tried any of those mineral compounds.
I would also not suggest anyone to be so technical about water. See, like I always say, as long as you enjoy the last cup, and as long as you're experimenting, I think you're on the right track, and you will always be happy about the cup of coffee.
And eventually, it again comes down to train your senses. The brewer wouldn't matter if your senses were not trained well enough to be actually able to perceive the differences.
Interesting. So, Mrugesh, been great. I expected this to be a very interesting conversation, and it so far has been. But it brings me to the last question. Again, a very not a general question, but just wanted to pick your mind and know what do you feel about Indian specialty coffee. So what do you think is the future of Indian specialty coffee, or what, as a brewer yourself, thinks about Indian specialty coffee? Where are we heading, or what's the current state of Indian specialty coffee?
I think we're in that bell curve where everybody is experimenting a lot, and at some point, but all of those experimentations, for whatever reason, could be climate change, or could be things the farmers can't control or the farms can't control, and so on and so forth. It's heading more towards fermented coffees. Here's a question for you, right? Fruit infused coffees.
Yes.
Versus heavily fermented coffees. Especially if you're, I don't know, does yeast fermentation actually involve yeast?
Yes.
Okay. At what point does that fermentation become a flavor infusion as opposed to the natural characteristics of the coffee? The reason I ask this is,
so the yeast would just help. It will not interfere like a fruit infusion might. Yeast just helps. What do you call, accentuate the flavor. it basically is trying to take the true potential of the coffee out at a coffee processing level rather than at a brewing or a cupping or a roasting level. So, like I always say, the life cycle of Indian specialty coffee has mainly four stages. One is the growing of coffee, one is the processing of coffee, third is the roasting of coffee, and fourth is brewing. And all are equally important. And I personally feel that the brewing and the roasting and the processing makes a lot of difference. So, um, infused coffees is something that I would not like to talk about, and neither I am in favor of, and neither do I personally brew those coffees. But they are very, very different from a anaerobic fermentation or an aerobic fermentation or a yeast fermented coffee. So those are things that are helping you get the true potential of the coffee, wherein infused coffee is trying to change the primary characteristics of the coffee altogether. So that would be an ideal difference between the both.
Okay, interesting. Because specialty coffee in general has this characteristic which is traceability, right? Transparency of where the coffee comes from. Do the characteristics
So do you
of the...
feel there is a gap in Indian specialty coffee?
No, but there's no... I wouldn't think there's a gap. Like, for example, let me put it this way, okay? A coffee that I get from Kerehaklu has very different resting characteristics from one I get from Ratnagiri. Your Nagaland coffee has a very different characteristics. Even then, Kohima brewed very differently from say Zunheboto.
Yes.
Right. If I'm buying a Kerehaklu, I know I probably have to rest this a lot longer, and the way the coffee was processed generally doesn't seem to make a difference in that, which is very weird for me. I don't understand the technicalities of the process and how that would change the resting characteristics. But for Kerehaklu, I always end up resting for a long time.
It does. Like, see, if you have like fermented coffees, for longer fermentation especially, you can rest it longer because it will taste much better. But then also you need to brew it faster and finish it faster. So for me, the thumb rule would be to rest the coffee longer in general. I recommend a longer resting period anyways, because no matter what experiments you do, a longer rested coffee or a well rested coffee will taste better. But in case of fermented coffees, you should definitely rest it longer, irrespective of the estate, irrespective of the terroir or the processing method.
Interesting that you say that, because that is the conclusion that I have also come to. I normally rest for 10 days nowadays before I brew the first cup. And okay, so just to finish this particular infusion versus non-infusion, my perspective on this transparency thing is, can I taste the characteristics of the environment in that coffee? This is a very highfalutin thing to say, like a very snobbish thing to say. But think about it this way. A coffee that comes from this farm with this kind of processing, I understand that this would probably mean this kind of a body, this kind of a flavor profile. And again, very generalized. As I said, I don't go into those, is this cashew or is this jackfruit anymore. To me, is this how fermented does it taste? How sweet does it taste? How acidic, do I like the acidity? Somebody had this very interesting thing about acidity at one point, which I read, which made a lot of sense. Is it like really lemony acidity that you can't tolerate, or is it like a grape-like acidity?
Yeah.
Okay, pleasant acidity versus unpleasant acidity. But again, that's on your preference, right?
Of course.
So that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for when I'm saying I'm buying from this region or I'm buying from this farm. Those characteristics, those would be the things that make sense to me when I'm buying coffee. If I'm buying from this region, I might be able to expect this kind of a coffee. For whatever reason, coffee from Ratnagiri seems to be easier to brew to me. I don't know why. They're just more consistent. They're just very easy to brew. There are some coffees which require a lot of tinkering, but that's also part of the pleasure, because the output is also correspondingly very interesting. Right now, off the top of my head, I probably can't list them down. I stopped logging all of these details like a couple of years ago due to changes in my circumstances and time availability and so on.
So,
but again,
are you getting different flavors? Do you feel the whole Indian specialty coffee is evolving?
that's
Where
my
do you
concern.
want it to be?
That's my concern. are we losing transparency for the sake of these weird, interesting processes? That's my concern. That is why I started with the extreme case scenario: infusion versus, let's say, fermentation.
Infusion, yes. I also agree with you that if you are infusing coffee, then it has to be mentioned and has to be super transparent that you have
Yeah.
infused the coffee. And I think up to an extent that is
They
happening.
do. They do. I've never had an infused coffee where it's not explicitly mentioned. And in case, for that matter, whenever I'm buying one of those infused coffees, every now and then I do. I know it's because I like this particular fruit infusion as opposed to this particular fruit infusion. So, and quite frankly, some of the most enjoyable cups I have had were infused, but COVID changed that. So, again, it's like my tongue evolves, right?
Yeah.
My
that is
palate
how it's
evolves.
supposed to be. Yeah.
And then I start leaning towards characteristics. But then the question for me comes down to this: when we say Indian coffee is evolving, which direction are we evolving in? Are we evolving in more towards a generalization where everything kind of sort of feels the same because everything is heavily fermented? Or can I say, okay, this coffee comes from this region, might be interesting, similar to altitude kind of thing, right?
So
Lower altitude.
from what I've
higher
understood, that is the bone you have to pick. That uh, because fermentation is happening at large right now, and everyone is trying to adapt that as a process. More or less, it's becoming the same. You're not getting any interesting flavors nowadays. So
Yeah, variation is becoming a bit of a challenge nowadays.
understood. Yeah.
So
But I think slowly, or probably even now, it's changing because the fact that fermentation is happening at a smaller or a bigger farm level is good, because which means that the producer now has better knowledge of what the yield is, how can the yield change, and this fermentation can actually get me a better output. So I kind of agree with you, but I also know that it's changing and the change is already happening right now. So yeah.
But at the same time, the coffee in general, that also has the side effect that the coffee in general is very enjoyable. So long as you
Yeah.
enjoy those
Yeah.
flavors. It's easier to pick coffee that because of this. Like,
Yeah.
okay, you are losing out on some of the extreme variations maybe in the flavors. Maybe you don't get those kind of things. But at the same time, it's also generally easier to buy coffee because you know this is going to, again, 90% of the time it's going to be
No,
what
so
you like.
that's what I believe in. Like, I think I've mentioned it over the period of the episode is for 3-4 times that as long as you enjoy your cup of coffee and you're getting a better cup of coffee every day, I think you're good to go. I think nonetheless, I think that's the right way to end our today's episode. Uh, uh, Keep experimenting, keep trying different coffees, and make sure you enjoy your cup of coffee your way, is what I would like to promote and I would like to mention. Thank you, Mrugesh, for giving us the extended time that you gave today. I would still like to say that it was hard to summarize and get everything in this episode, but there is a lot more that we can discuss, and I think that we will be able to do this again probably for another season. And yeah,
There are
thanks.
so many details that we haven't gone to in terms of the actual brewing.
Hopefully the
Rest-
comment section of the video will
Hopefully.
give us a chance.
Yep.
So whatever your comments, please drop in. We'll make sure that Mrugesh gets those comments and then we will be able to answer them. Nonetheless, thank you, Mrugesh, for being on this podcast. Uh, See you all for the episode number 2. This is Behind the Coffee. This is me, Chirag, from Graceful Coffee Roasters, your host and roast master. See you in the next episode.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Mrugesh.
I love geeking out about
That's
coffee.
a wrap.